So you want to learn how to become more consistent with landing your ice spikes and securing killing blows in PvP. My name's Drygos. I have over 3,000 hours playing this build, and today I'm going to teach you everything there is to know about how to use this ability so that you can become an absolute demon and melt every opponent out there. This is not a build guide, it's a tutorial. We'll talk about some of the fundamentals of ice spike, we'll go over some mechanical things, how to aim it, some of my favorite combos and setups that I use to destroy my opponents. If you're interested in a build guide, there's an up-to-date guide that I created linked in the description below. Otherwise, let's get started. Let's talk about some of the fundamentals of ice spike. Firstly, pathing. Ice spike comes out in a straight line, and everything in the path indicated by the small spikes will take 56% weapon damage. This becomes much more powerful when you go down the tree for deadly path, which enhances the pathing of the spike to do 10% more damage and stagger any target that gets hit by it. The final spike of ice spike is called mighty spike. This is the big spike at the end of the pathing that shoots out, which is where you get most of your burst potential from this ability, doing 157% weapon damage and also staggering the enemy. You can control where the mighty spike fires off by left clicking it to exit the pathing, which is really useful for aiming. The stagger from the pathing and the mighty spike are insanely powerful because you can use them both offensively and defensively to interrupt your opponents and create a ton of space. As a note, on the PTR, the stagger of the spike might get removed, but we won't know until it's released in live. The final thing to talk about is spiky reach, which is huge. It enhances the mighty spike to shoot projectiles from all directions in a 6-meter radius, doing 118% weapon damage, indicated by the blue markers that shoot out when you proc a mighty spike. This is where you can get a double, triple, or even quadruple proc of burst damage, depending on how perfectly you aim and land the spike. For aiming, we'll talk about that a bit more in just a few moments. As a note, there's a bug with mighty spike, so in order to proc the projectiles from spiky reach, you have to left click to invoke the mighty spike for it to work. When it comes to aiming the ice spike, there's absolutely no substitute for practice. Consistency comes from practice. It's a very difficult ability to hit properly, but when you get good, you'll absolutely slap. When I was learning, I would run around the world and ice spike every enemy mob I could find for an hour or two. I'd go over to the training dummies and practice my aiming and distancing constantly. And even today, I duel constantly and play OPR for hours just to practice. That said, let's talk about crosshair placement. Why is it so difficult? It's not like other abilities where it lands exactly where your crosshair is. You actually have to aim slightly to the bottom right of the target in addition to estimating the distance and positioning properly. Ping will affect this ability a lot, so you're just going to have to practice on your server to get a feel for it. The second part of aiming in the ice spike is utilizing your left click effectively to spawn the mighty spike at the proper distance. The best timing to spawn the mighty spike is just after it passes through your target. This will ensure that the target takes damage from the pathing, the mighty spike, and also the spiky reach projectiles. Landing a 2-proc ice spike consistently is what you should be aiming for, and when we talk about a 2-proc ice spike, it's essentially the damage from the mighty spike and the damage from the projectiles of the spiky reach hitting your target. The 3 and 4 proc spikes have a lot to do with whether or not the targets are moving. It's less about what's in your control and more about luck of timing. Those 3 and 4 proc spikes come from spiky reach, and if the targets are not moving, it's not going to proc, which is why when you're at the training dummies practicing, you'll never see it hit more than twice. All that aside, aiming and estimating the distance of the ice spikes is only half the battle. It's also about knowing when to use it. I see a lot of spikers out there running around, chucking out ice spikes all willy-nilly without thinking about whether or not it's a good time to use the actual spike. The best time to use the spike is when the enemy is completely stamina starved, or when you set them up in a combo where they're rooted or snared. With roots and snares, however, it's also important to anticipate whether or not the enemy is going to dodge immediately after you snare them to avoid wasting your spike. Aside from those, you can also go for some Hail Mary spikes to catch your enemy off guard. For instance, if a melee is running at you in a straight line, or if you're just feeling confident enough to anticipate where they might be moving to. You will become much more consistent with landing your ice spikes when you become smarter with how you use it. You will miss a lot, but when you practice, you're gonna get better, I promise. When it comes to landing an ice spike, aiming and knowing when to use it can go a long way. But if you really want to elevate your gameplay, it's important to learn some of the best setups and combos to maximize your damage and kill potential. A big part of success with ice spike depends on the setups and combos you create by outplaying your opponent. Before we jump in, let's quickly go through some of our damage multiplier abilities. Firstly, we have Oblivion, which increases our damage by up to 15% if we're standing in it. Secondly, we have Orb of Decay, which will rend the target, increasing the damage by up to 15% if you can stack it up to 3 times, but typically you can get a 10% rend with just a single orb by landing it properly and detonating it just as it passes through the target. Our last damage multiplier is from Ultimate Chill. This you can get from using our Ice Storm on the target, increasing our frost damage by up to 25% and also increasing our crit chance by 15% if we're spec'd properly. When it comes to setups and combos, the main thing to remember is all the damage multipliers that we have in our ability toolkit. That's the 15% damage boost we get from Oblivion, the 10% rend we get from Orb, and the 25% damage we get from Storm into a spike. Now, it's nearly impossible to leverage all of that in a single setup for PvP. However, it's important to know all the multipliers so that you can break it down into mini damage combos along the way. For instance, if I do a Storm into a heavy attack, into a spike, into a light attack, it's just as valuable because I'm doing 25% additional damage from the heavy, the spike, and the light attack. Another example is an early rend into an Oblivion into a spike. This is also giving us the 10% rend plus the 15% damage from the Oblivion, giving us a total of 25% additional damage. These multipliers are the most important things to be thinking about when you're doing your combos to maximize your damage. Now, when it comes to spike setups, the easiest one to do is Scream Orb Spike. This is really powerful because the Scream will stagger the enemy, giving you free damage from the orb, and you usually have just enough time to send the spike off before they're able to get out of the snare if you do it fast enough. If they're low health when you scream them, it's a given. It's a guaranteed land. It's a small combo, but huge potential, and it's a quick and easy one to do. My favorite one to do at ranged, especially if they're stamina starved, is Storm, Heavy Attack, Spike, immediately followed by a light attack. I always follow my spikes with light attacks because if you land the spike, it staggers the enemy, giving you free damage, and it hits like a truck, especially if they're in the ultimate chill from that damage multiplier. Another combo, which comes down to situational awareness, for instance, depending if they have stamina left when you scream them, or a rapier, is a scream into an orb, into a storm, into a heavy, into a spike, into a light. Weaving the storm in after the orb works perfectly with their timing of the dodge, giving you the chance to heavy freeze them into that spike. It's a complicated combo, but the more you practice it, the better you'll get. It really just depends on what's happening, but the main thing I want to get through to you is to make sure you're leveraging your multipliers as much as you can to set up those big burst windows. It's also important to use your snares and roots to ensure that you land your spikes. I hope you enjoyed this video as much as I enjoyed making it. If you want to see a more in-depth guide that actually goes very into detail about gearing, there's a link in the description below. As always, please show some love, smash those like and subscribe buttons. I'll be making plenty of content like this in the future. And if you have any questions, leave me a message below